Hey, you're listening to a Bible Brodown podcast, a member of the Trinity Commission. This is where brothers come together to sharpen one another so we can rightly divide the Word of God. I'm Matt.
And this is Billy.
And we're back. Billy and I. We're going to actually do what we promised to do last week, which was we're going to actually finally talk about slavery. But before we get into that, some small updates. I think the plan for next week is to have Dr. Jonathan Pritchett over and talk about the discussion. I wouldn't call it a debate so much as a discussion between, between James White and I forgot it, John
Craneman.
John, if you listen to this, we apologize for not remembering. We'll correct that later. But we plan on listening to or going over our thoughts from that discussion debate thing over on the Unbelievable podcast. I thought John did great.
He did really good for not. I mean, this isn't his thing at all,
right? And James White did about what you'd expect James White to do. So
yeah, it was not anything that wooed me or anything.
Right,
I wasn't wooed.
So next week we will. I
wasn't impressed.
Much deeper. I know.
Not
right.
Impressed.
We could have basically written his stuff for him. This is the Calvinist talking points on these verses, and whatever. We'll get into all that. Anything else coming up? You know what I realized? And I'll say it on the podcast because, that for sure. But my baby's now 2 months old instead of just freshly born, which is weird. No, so we got this flashy new logo that we love, and we owe a certain someone who created it for us a T-shirt that both of us have completely failed to design. And I thought about that because I was wearing, when I put this hat on, I was like, it'd be so awesome if I had the BB right here. Right?
It would. I tasked you with doing that, and I think you looked at it and couldn't find anything that gave you a big pow. The one that gave you a big pow was $70 or something like that, and that's obviously not what we want to, sell.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll just call that Matthew's fault, but we do need to get, and I want to be, so here's what I want to do is I kind of want to, there's got to be a website, and maybe if you're listening to this and you know of something that would fit this bill, there's got to be a website where we can just go and design stuff, and if you want it, you go log in there and just click it and you buy it, but it's not something we have to buy and store and then ship out to you.
Right.
If that makes sense. But I also don't want it to be just super bland generic stuff. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too picky.
I think you're being too picky. We're not a corporation. We're not even a nonprofit.
I know. I'm picky for myself, and I want I want athletic shirts, and not just white cotton T-shirts. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We'll figure something out. But we haven't forgotten about our very gracious creator. Not God, but our logo creator. We haven't forgotten about God either. We haven't forgotten about our logo creator. She is going to get something from us.
Yeah.
Oh, but anyway. So yeah. Any other updates or thoughts before we jump into the spreadsheet?
No. I've had a lot of good discussions on Facebook. Even got a question from a local friend just last night. I always enjoy those conversations. Yesterday, I don't know if you saw it. I had a conversation with, is it Andrew? Is that his name? He was talking about blasphemy of the Spirit. Did you see that? Yeah.
Didn't see it.
You didn't see that thread?
I've missed a bunch of stuff for the last couple, because the last week and a half have been super busy at work. So I hit what I can in the evenings, but by then I have 30 notifications and I miss stuff as I go through it.
Yeah, right.
Any of that good mini material by any chance?
Oh yeah. We've talked about blasphemy of the Spirit, but I think it was actually because he made me write it out. It was pretty good. Just understanding what it means when Christ can say, any sin against the Son of Man can be forgiven, but sin against the Holy Spirit can't be forgiven. What that, how do we distinguish that? And can it be distinguished? And we kind of sort of mentioned it a little bit on a mini, or on our episode.
Yeah, I got that same. So it's kind of sounds like the typical, well, if Christ paid for all sins, Why is that sin not covered situation?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So yes, let's talk through that for the mini, because I got that from a Calvinist recently in a different group. I won't advertise for him.
Yeah, you've been in another Calvinist group, which is very unique for you, because usually
I just avoid it completely.
A couple of years ago, you just like jumped out of all that, stopped talking about it, and yeah.
Not that I'm like, I just
afraid. It's just
they weren't fruitful. Yeah,
right.
I was just like, and someone did compliment us recently. I won't call them out, but
on our looks, on how we own the internet.
I mean, everybody compliments our looks. That's why we make podcasts, because of our looks. That's why it took us a year to get onto YouTube. No, they said that they like the fact that we don't, and I'm not trying to pat us on the back, but it's something we strive to do, which is not to attack other positions necessarily. We do have episodes like about Tulip or something like that, but they're very few. And our goal has always been to just provide a positive explanation or offense for what we believe, and not necessarily go to all these different views and try to knock down what they believe.
Right.
Or maybe best defense. I don't know. Offense, defense. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's more speaking of like, this is what we believe and why we believe it, and why we don't believe other things. We've done a few episodes where we've talked about various positions. Hell, we went through like the three main positions. We've looked at the one saved, always saved, just either or. So there's only two of those. We've talked about those. Generally, we try to just provide our opinion and the scriptural reasons for it, and we try to do it in an in-depth way where people can understand kind of like the bigger picture of where we're coming from. Because that's what I've seen so much in the past years, is that somebody will say, I'm this or I'm that. You want to break it down there? The song, I'm this and I'm that and I'm this and
No,
anyway.
Let's you wrap it and we'll dance. Go ahead.
I'm this or I'm that, and people, the opponent or the audience will automatically assume all sorts of things because that one statement or that one phrase or whatever. They're not actually listening to try to find out what that person means by what they're saying.
Right. Well, another thing I've noticed is when you're having a discussion with someone, if you don't clarify which view you're looking at, you get a lot of like, just take Calvinism and not Calvinism for instance. If I'm having a discussion with a Calvinist and they say, well, and we're talking about, let's say, the universal witness, and they say, I don't believe that because of this stuff in Calvinism, and I say, well, I don't believe, I do believe it, and your stuff in Calvinism is wrong. All of a sudden, we've crossed these wires, and we're like talking about two different things at the same time. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you just say, okay, what do we say about universal witness, and what are the supports and not for that? And don't even really bring up Calvinism. Like, we can talk about each individual verse as we go along, but we don't necessarily have to bring in that second world or soteriology, because it just muddies everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that really applies, this whole discussion applies to our topic at hand, which is slavery. Yep. As soon as you mention slavery, people automatically assume one kind of thing. And that's not always what things mean by that. Ancient writings don't always mean the same thing when they mention slavery, including the Bible. Right. So.
Exactly. I mean, when we say it, we're both Americans. So when we say it, we think generally the American South before the Civil War, and even a little after. It evokes images of people in chains, absolutely no rights, or at least very, very little human rights. Possibly in other parts of the world, some kind of genocide. I would consider the Holocaust, and those people were taken into slavery, experimented on, and then a lot of them are killed. So you have like there's death involved, and it just is a very, very dark thing. And I don't really see any kind of economic use of the word slave today. It doesn't, aside from feeling like a slave at work, like just kind of metaphorically.
But I mean that is one way that the Bible uses slavery, just like you said.
Exactly.
So, most people, whether they watch, a Spartan movie or an ancient Game of Thrones, a medieval movie, right? They think of people who have been kidnapped and enslaved, right? Like one people conquered another people and enslaved them and put them in chains, and these people have no rights and all that stuff. And while there is that in the Bible, a huge portion of it has nothing to do with that.
Exactly. So, first thing I want to call out is, before we dive into, I said spreadsheet, and I was, yes, it's a spreadsheet. It's a big spreadsheet. Before we get into that, if you haven't listened to the Trinity Radio episodes, there's 2 parts on slavery. Go listen to those, because we're not going to do the same thing they did. They had a conversation about what these verses could mean, and how to use it kind of apologetically. In particular, Exodus 21, and how the way an atheist or a skeptic would use those verses and say, see, your God is a moral monster, because he said, this life isn't worth that life, and you can trade people, and it's definitely a beating a straw man what they do.
Right.
So
Definitely.
go listen to those, because it'll give you a good idea of, okay, so here's the Christian apologetic or explanation for those verses. Our goal, what I did, and the kind of process you'll see is, I went into Bible Gateway, and I did a search for slave. And then I went into Bible, and then I did the same thing for the word servant. And then I cross-referenced that with every single Greek or Hebrew word. We're only looking at Old Testament. I looked at every instance of that word and what the translation was, what the actual Hebrew word was, just to get an idea of where life and kids, of what words we're even talking about. What is the semantic range that we're dealing with in these words? Hold on a second.
Yeah, definitely. Matt is, being a dad, so we have real life that you get to watch on our show. What's interesting is the same way that we see the slavery used in the Old Testament. That's what generally people bring up when they're talking about slavery. In the like, look how bad the Christian God is. They look at the Old Testament. What's interesting, if you just type in slave in the Bible Gateway under the NASB, there's actually more uses of slave in the New Testament than in the Old Testament. I actually just did that right before we started in the NASB, and there's 78 references of slave in the Old Testament, and there's 111 references of slave in the New Testament, and that's with the NASB. So it's always funny, though, that people point to the Old Testament in that, because there's certain passages, and again, the Trinity Radio episodes really covered those specific ones, and those often objections pointing to God being like this big moral monster.
Another disclaimer before we get into this: Billy and I are not Hebrew experts, so we will consistently mispronounce every Hebrew word we come across. You'll just have to forgive us for that. But just to give you an idea of some of the words that we're dealing with, so just to pick on Braxton a little, he said that the words that he's translated slave or servant are abed and amah. That is not incorrect, but there are also many others. Shifcha, Leviticus 19:20. The phrase purchased person is also one that's translated slave. It's kind of an idiomatic thing. We also have Nethinim, Pelach, Sharath. I think there are a couple others in here. Abed. So we're going to look at all of them. And I'm going to try and figure out a way to make this spreadsheet available, because what I did was I pulled all these together. I noted what the original word was. And then I made a note out to the side that says kind of just a brief synopsis of what the verse is saying and context around it. And last disclaimer before we just jump in. For the word servant, there was 800 references to do. And I would say 150 of them, maybe 200 of them, are all in the history books. So Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles.
Right.
And pretty much 100% of the uses of those are in the same way. And I got so tired of just going through and saying the same thing over and over that there's a big blank on those, because I couldn't do it. So if I do eventually share this, you'll see what I'm talking about. But let's go ahead and look at slave first. All the and yeah, like Billy said, I'm using I pulled it from NASB. ESV is going to be a little different. NIV is going to be a little different. Just whatever you're using. There may be some small changes, but NASB uses of our translations to the word slave or whatever we're looking at. And I just want to kind of go through the list. I guess this is going to be a very Bible heavy episode, just to get some context.
So what are the dots on the right column?
So I guess, yeah. on the spreadsheet, there's column E, which is the far right column, have asterisks, and I put an asterisk into any on the side of any verse that is a little different, maybe a little nuanced, something worth looking at to capture the whole context of why, this is translated slave, but there's something a little different here than in the previous verse that was translated slave, and it was interesting to me. So that's kind of why I filtered mine by those, and we'll just kind of go through specifically those verses, because I think that'll give us the range for what we're looking at. So
is this in order? So you have Ebed. So like you said, you looked up in English slave and in English servant, and then went and found out which words those were in the Hebrew.
Yeah, a lot of Excel wizardry was involved. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of hidden tabs on here that you can't see.
Right. So for instance, like the first one appears to be in Genesis 9 for both, right?
Right.
So Genesis 9 is this first word, Ebed, which again can be translated slave or servant, and the first use is servant. Genesis 9:25. It's interesting. I've heard in so many sermons, like, people will always cite, this is the first time X or Y happens, and they always put a big emphasis on it being the first, and somehow that makes it, I don't know. Have you heard this before?
Not in that way.
No.
But so let's go to the slave tab.
Okay.
Filter it by asterisks. That way you get, and we'll start with Genesis 44:9 and just bounce through these. So Genesis 44:9. Hold on 1 second. Yep.
This thing is quite large, the spreadsheet, and he does have the New Testament in here, but there's not a lot of notes on that portion.
What?
I was saying that you do have New Testament in here. You just...
Yeah, but I didn't go through every instance of the word doulos. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So Genesis 44:9, with whomever of your servants it is found, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves. So you got servant and you got slave there. This is talking about Joseph's brothers, and there is some kind of property that's gone missing that Joseph has said, hey, it's missing, and they go after Joseph's brothers after they've left. Yep. And I think this, if I remember right, this is a ploy to get Benjamin to stay with Joseph.
Right. Yep. Joseph is the one that put something on one of the animals, if I recall.
Exactly. And so they're saying, so when you read with whomever of your servants it is found, let them be my Lord's slaves, you have in both instances them submitting to Joseph, even though he hasn't like conquered them in battle or anything like that. The reason they came to him is because there's a famine. They need food. And so out of respect, they're saying, we're your servants. And there is a difference here between we're submitting as your servant, and if whoever the offending person is, he'll be your slave.
Right.
As if slave in this situation, Abed, is a punishment. Right. So we got punishment. Genesis 47:19. Why should we die before? Go ahead.
Just to throw in there, it's in this instance, it's the person putting themselves as the other person's slave. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're allowing them to be.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Genesis 47:19, and that's a theme, honestly.
Yes.
The idea that it is a willful submission. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate. So, again, this is 47. Genesis 47 is the brothers of Joseph, Israel, and they're saying, look, buy us out. We'll be your slave, but we need food or we're going to die.
Right.
It is, in this situation, it is both a willful submission and also an economic exchange, right?
Mm-hmm.
Buy out our stuff.
Right. And if you look at that in like modern days, like I'm going to buy out that company, right? And that means everyone that now works there now works for me. They're my servants. They're my workers.
Yeah.
You know, and there's an expectation there that if you buy me out, that I'm going to work for you, but you're also going to provide for me. I.e., in today's modern context, we would say you're going to provide me money. But in this instance, they're asking for food.
And then in 47:25, again, Genesis 47:25, you have a similar situation. They're offering their servitude as a client to a gracious patron, right? That this Pharaoh is giving them this stuff through Joseph. And so they're saying, we submit, we'll be your slave
Right.
or servant.
Yeah, I mean, there's much. This one again, I think this one with 44 and 47, where they're asking to. There's not an economic exchange, but basically they're becoming indentured servants.
Yep. For some kind of gain,
Right.
we will submit to you.
Right.
I didn't actually capture the name of the person. So Genesis 49:15 is a little different. This is if you can look up real quick and see what the name of this person is. This is Abad, not Abed, Abad. I think it's actually from the same root word. When he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, he bowed his shoulders to bear burdens and became a slave at forced labor. So this person has found a piece of land he wants to live on, and he has made himself a slave to forced labor by starting to work the land.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't even to another person. This is just him submitting to work.
Right. It's Issachar lying down between the sheepfolds when he saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant. He bowed his shoulder to bear burdens, and he became a slave at forced labor. I see there, and tell me if maybe I'm not seeing this right, but that's almost like the curse, right? Where we're now slaves to the land. And that's basically what this person is acknowledging, that this is a good piece of land. I'm going to work this land. I'm going to be a slave to this land.
Yeah, the curse right there out of Eden. I'm going to kick you out, and you're going to have to work the land.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that what the Bible calls us? We are like slaves to the earth. We're slaves to we are indentured to have to work for a living.
Exactly.
So either we're gonna work on our own with by our own hand if we know how to do that, if we're capable of doing that, and if we're not capable of doing that, well, we need to find someone who is and work for them.
You know, it's interesting. I actually kind of had that conversation with my 8-year-old this recently. She was like, "Dad, why do you work so much?" I said, "Because if I don't, you won't have anything. But also, even if I'm not working," he said, "if you had all the money," really a sophisticated way of asking that. If you had all the money, would you still work? And I said, "Well, yeah. I mean, not at my job. No offense to the people I work with. I like them. But if I had enough to retire right now, I would still find something probably ministry to do full time, because we are designed to work." I think one of the biggest in my own life, I'll just say this, when I wasn't working, that's when I was most prone to depression. But working, being productive, and doing things, that's when I felt more fulfilled just on a day-to-day basis. So we're designed to work. And that reminds me of Romans 6:16 and 17. We are the slaves to the ones whom we submit. We're either going to work to please ourselves or we're going to work to please God at the end of the day.
Right.
So then we get to Exodus 21 and 21:2, 21:5, 7, 20, 26, 27, 32, all somewhat different uses of the word slave, but not different uses, but this is the chapter that any atheist or skeptic is going to go to and say, "Ha, this is where your Bible falls apart and your God is evil."
Right. Braxton and Jonathan did a good episode on this specific one.
Absolutely. These are all Abed, and I'll just run through kind of the synopsis of what these are. So these are rules for Hebrew slaves in verses 2 and 5. In verses 7 through 11, it's about purchasing a wife for oneself or one son and the rights that wife has. So it's not just they were pimps and they were selling their women.
Right.
It was actually like paying a dowry. There's a young lady you want to marry. You have to provide something to that family to make up for the loss that they're going to experience because they're losing a worker, essentially. I mean, everybody in the family had to work to support the family. Or if you're buying for your son, buying if you're finding a wife for your son. But that wife did not come over in chains. She had rights, and it's expelled out there 7 through 11. And then verses 20, the slave is a master's property along the lines of a kind of like an employee is a manager's property to an extent. In the business world, you have resources, but the most valuable resource you can possibly have are the people that work for you. And that's somewhat what it's saying here. I'm a resource of the people that give me my paycheck. I'm property in a sense because I've submitted to them.
There's also very much the socio-cultural idea wasn't individualized, right? Where I wasn't like some unique, separate member
Snowflake?
of my family. What's that?
Snowflake.
I represented my family. So as a man or a woman, right? If I committed dishonor, I've also dishonored my family, my group that I belong with, right? Just like an employee. If you go to the post office or the DMV and somebody there does something, that angers you or does something stupid, right? You look at now the DMV or the post office badly as the group, right? There's that.
Right.
And that's kind of what we see is that if another family provides this dowry, and for a wife for their son, again, the wife has rights. However, the woman wants to honor her family as well, right? So there's an honor that comes along with this indentured servitude or whatever you want to call it.
Absolutely. Verses 26 and 27 about physical punishment of slaves. And I know people get bent out of shape about this, but I think about, and it's not so much today, but even when I was a kid, I was practically perfect, so it didn't apply to me. But at schools, at
the
schools,
golden child,
exactly. Some schools were allowed to paddle students.
Right.
They act up. They go to the principal's office. Principal whoop-ow with a big old wooden paddle or whatever they had. And nowadays, some people would say that is atrocious and horrendous. But back in the day, don't act up. It won't happen. Similar situation going on here. You're allowed to. We see beating. Let's see, what does it say? If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he shall let him go free. If he knocks out a tooth, so we have the situation where there's some kind of corporal punishment allowed, but any form of disfigurement is considered too far, and you got to let them go because you just took it too far.
Right.
So the idea that you could go around beating your slaves and just be an awful, terrible person. Again, we're thinking America in the South prior to the Civil War, where it was awful conditions, and that
we think they're whipping them. That's not right.
Scarring them up, but no, physical.
And like you said, even in today's world, people discipline their kids. Right? Reality, kids are really your slaves. Right? Right. They have rights, but really they have to do what you say. Right? And you can beat them. Right, but you're not supposed to leave marks, otherwise child services comes, right?
Well, and I think we just generally know there is a big difference between a swat on the butt, which is a big cushioned area that communicates to kids pretty well, and like actually what we would consider beating. That yes, obviously there's a difference, and no, we don't condone abuse, but if you gotta pop your kid on the butt because they're being straight up disrespectful, that's up between you and the kid. Be a parent. So, verse 32.
I think about, when you get older, and at least for me, and I now have seen it with my son, where they're like, I would rather you spank me now than to ground me for 2 weeks. I'd be like, oh, give me the 30-second pain, right, that I can suffer through it, and then I can go out and play with my friends again. And the same thing is we have various versions of this today. In the military, there's corporal discipline, push-ups, crunches, you
jogging
have to spend
or running. Yeah.
No, in basic training, right? They don't beat you any longer, right? They don't hit you as they used to in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s even. But now they make you they put you in pain in many other ways. Out in the 100-degree temperature, and you're doing push-ups for an hour.
And you're just saying, please beat me? Is that
Right.
just hit me with something.
Yes.
Yeah. So the idea that God was saying, feel free to beat the people that work for you. This is a punishment situation, and you can't take it too far. You have to let them go.
Right.
So Exodus 21:32, provision to master for the injury of a slave. So if a slave gets hurt or something, how should you be repaid for that? Because again, a servant is a worker, a slave is a worker. That is a resource, that is income that you're impacted by. So if someone else's property hurts your property, you get some kind of payment for that. Exodus 23:12, Amah. It's a different word. 6 days you are to do work, but on the seventh day you shall cease from labor, so that your ox or your donkey may rest, so that your son or your female slave, as well as your stranger, may refresh themselves. And this Amah is 5:19 if you want to look it up. But it's a maid or a handmaid. It's just a hired girl that works in your house. It's really not more complicated than that. Leviticus 19:20 is shifcha. I guess I'm saying that right. I have no idea if I'm saying that right. Now a man lies carnally with a woman who is a shifcha, a slave acquired for another man. So, but who has in no way been redeemed nor given freedom, there shall be punishment. So this is protecting a woman who's been essentially, as we saw earlier, paid for to marry someone else. If another guy comes along and takes her, we'll keep this PG, then there's ramifications. But this is shifcha as a purchased woman, a betrothed, or the dowry has been given for this woman. That's what it's talking about. Again, it's not pimping people out. This isn't a prostitute or anything. Leviticus 22:11. This is one of those idioms. It's just a purchased person, but they translate it slave. But if a priest buys a purchased person as his property with his money, that one may eat of it, and those who are born in his house may eat of his food. So this is the rights of a slave in a household. And again, it's not. The word isn't abed or abad or amah. It's a phrase, a person brought with money. And again, they have rights. They are protected. This isn't just a do what you want with them class of people.
One thing that really fits with this that I was thinking about, I had to look it up to be sure. So, sports teams, professional sports teams, like the NFL and the NBA and they will put insurance on their players. So if their player gets hurt, because they are a commodity, as Matt mentioned before, a resource, right, to the NBA or the NFL or the specific team. Likewise, when I'm a movie star and I sign a contract to do X or Y movie, right, they put insurance on me in case I get sick or die, right, because they're spending millions of dollars on you and on this project, and they put insurance on you. Where if something would happen, they are protected because you are under contract. You are a commodity for them. So that goes right along with the same kind of, there was this contractual obligation with this indentured servitude.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of obligation, Leviticus 25:46. Here's another verse that a skeptic might appeal to. This is abad. You may even bequeath them being slaves or purchased persons, them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the ones of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. So the difference we have here is these permanent slaves are not Israel; these are Gentile slaves. And if you read the context here, there is these slaves are when Israel went into Canaan and took the land from everybody.
Prisoners
they defeated
of war.
all these different kings. Exactly. But not all of them were forced to leave. So this is Israel's rightful place. God is giving it to them. Anybody who is going to stay has to work for Israel. So that's what we see here. That those people groups who decided or who stayed that Israel did not completely kill or didn't move out, they were the ones that were enslaved or servants to Israel. So people again might think well, that's terrible. But consider the fact that when back in the time when you took over an area, you took over the farmland, you took over the resources, you took over everything. And if someone else is going to live there and use the stuff that you own now, well, they're going to have to pay for it somehow. But you own all the resources, so the only thing that they have to bring to the table is labor. So it's an economic situation as much as it is it's not really even a prisoner of war situation. These are survivors of war, and it's an economic benefit to them to stay, work for you, and actually get to live there.
Right. You can look at the history books and see that most of the time there was that offer, right, where I've taken over, I now own your farmland, and you can either serve on the land and work the land for me, right, or you can leave and try to make it on your own, right? But you're going to have to travel out 600 miles because I own all this land for 600 miles. So,
exactly.
Good luck.
And I'm going to spread my people out on it. Yeah.
Right. It's not like this person could, hitchhike down the road a mile and go work for Walmart, put in an application, and try to find another job.
I'm glad you brought that up. It sounds so silly to say, but it wasn't like they had big chain employment back then. There wasn't a 7-Eleven on the corner.
Right.
You worked for people.
Right.
Families.
Either you had a trade, and many people were farmers, so if your land was taken, you had to go find more land, or you just had to work for somebody who owned the farm, i.e. you're a servant, and it's biblical language is sometimes called slave, or you had to find a new trade. I mean, it's very economic, it's very contractual. It wasn't relating to, you had no rights, there was beatings and all this stuff. So people get this word in their head and that's all they think of, but that's not what the Bible is talking about. And going back to the idea of prisoners of war, I mean, here's an option. I take over your land, we either kill all of you, or you're going to work for us.
Or you
rights.
move the 600 miles to the east
Right.
and deal with that kingdom.
Right.
You've been displaced. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So this is actually kind of a mercy in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So 1 Samuel 4:9, take courage and be men, O Philistines, or you will be slaves to the Hebrews as they have been slaves to you. So this is someone trying to build up the Philistines, right? And this is the idea here is slavery is a demonstration of authority, and the winning nation of a war gets to enslave the other one. And we see this over and over in Israel's situation. They repent to God, and then eventually they get complacent, and then they rebel against God, and God says, fine. And he brings in a kingdom that enslaves them for a while, beats them in combat, enslaves them, and then he sets them free again.
Right.
So,
again, think about your options here. You've just taken over an entire country. So that country could have thousands of people left, hundreds of thousands of people left. So you could either just annihilate them all, kill them all, which doesn't seem like a very nice thing to do. Right? You could force them to go somewhere else, which means now you have land that is going to be hard to do, or they can be servants to you. They can be slaves to you. Again, this isn't where you've, this isn't, we should bring this up too. I guess now's a good spot as any. This isn't them kidnapping them. This is now they've conquered them in war, just like throughout human history, just like in the Americas. We've conquered various lands, and now that land is ours. And yes, we look back on certain things now and think, oh, we could have done things better, right? Indians, for instance, Native Americans, right? We could have done things better,
yeah,
right? Yeah. But this was economics. This is how the spoils of war worked. Again, the Bible never condones just going into some city and kidnapping people and then selling them as slaves. In fact, it said that if anyone does that, they were to be put to death. So never, and the Trinity radio guys mentioned this, never is it ever condoned that you go in, see some people of another race, kidnap them, put them on ships, haul them over, and sell them. No, you were to be put to death if you did that. That was against God's law.
Yep. I'm not going to read all these verses, but I want to skim through a couple of high points before we get to the wisdom literature, which I think is extremely important for understanding slavery in the Old Testament. But 1 Kings 9:22, really verses 15 through 21 is the situation of Solomon levying forced labor from the surrounding people that have been conquered. And it's almost like a tax. You'll be my slave, because I'm allowing you to live here. Just like Billy was saying,
Mm-hmm.
a nation goes in and conquers. And again, you got to get out of our current socioeconomic mindset. Our worldview is conquering another country. That doesn't seem right. But for 5,000 years, I mean, back up right before World War I, honestly, you have these empire building. Take Britain, for instance. They spread out all over they had lands all over the world, and they were the empire. The empire never set on the British Empire. Why? Because they had little dots all over the globe, and not the flat earth, the globe, where where they owned that land. They conquered it, and those people were, in a sense, enslaved to them, although they were free to work and be industrious and whatever. So that is a completely different context, and the Old Testament is a completely different context that they were thinking in, and we can't apply how we would feel about it today to their situation then.
Right.
That's the wrong way to look at it, and that's really the wrong way to look at Scripture, honestly.
Right. Same thing that you see throughout, again, history books where you mentioned England, or you could mention Rome, right? They would levy a city. And then they would say, okay, now you serve the emperor now, or the king, or whatever, right? You can continue to work, but we're going to tax you first of all, right, to support the king. And if we go to war, we can call you to do whatever we want you to do. Contractual economic obligations.
Can we go ahead and admit that taxes are a form of slavery?
Absolutely.
I mean, can you live in this country and... Well, no, that's going to start a whole different debate and not pay taxes. I mean, yes, you actually can live in this country and not pay taxes, but can you be successful in this country and get away with not paying the government anything?
The same thing that the military is. We have a volunteer military, right? You're becoming a bondservant to the military. Guess what? You have to do exactly what they say.
Absolutely.
Or suffer the consequences.
Yeah, serious legal consequences. Absolutely. 2 Kings 4:1, a slightly different use of abed. So this is a creditor is going to take a debtor as a slave if they don't pay it off. So I owe Billy money, I can't pay it off, and Billy is going to take me as a servant or slave until that the value of that debt is paid.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of uses so far.
Kind of like when somebody dies and they come after the family for the debt today.
Yeah.
They don't make you slaves. They just try to take all of your money.
They levy your wages. Yeah.
Right.
So let me read 3 verses in a row, and then we'll break them down. Proverbs 22:7. The rich rules over the poor, and borrowers, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Proverbs 29:21. He who pampers his slave from childhood will in the end find him to be a son. Proverbs 30:10. Do not slander a slave to his master, or he will curse you, and you will be found guilty. So I think the first was pretty obvious. 22:7. Debt is is slavery. If I owe Billy money, in a sense, I am his slave. And this isn't Billy is not gonna come over to my house. I mean, even if I did owe him money, he would never do this. But he wouldn't come over to my house and like beat me or anything. But there is an expectation that I would pay him, or I would provide work to pay him. What do you think about 29:21? He who pampers his slave from childhood will in the end find him to be a son.
That is very theological when I think about God and us. He who pampers his slave. I mean, that tells you the mentality of what wisdom literature of how you should treat your servants, your slaves. Again, I using the word slave is it's a terrible word to use because it's not what we imagine today.
So much baggage.
Yeah. He who pampers his servant, right? And you think about even in work, right, or in the military. I remember I just mentioned the military and how basically you're a bondservant, right? Voluntary bondservant you're putting yourselves under the rule of the military. I remember being in basic training. So the first 3 months in the Marine Corps basic training, my mom recently showed me letters that I wrote, where I mentioned that I had all this respect and honor towards my senior drill instructor. I said he's like it's like he's become a dad to me, and that's in my letter. So here I am. I volunteered to do this. I'm getting treated in one way terribly, but another way with much respect, and in another way with much respect and honor, where there's like this privilege and there's this deep respect, and where I want to honor, the senior member that was training me.
Yeah, and I exactly. If this is wisdom to the Israelites, if this is Hebrew wisdom, then the idea that Exodus 21 is feel free to beat your servants and people suck is not right. If I have someone who's working with my family and they work with my family for years and they see my kids grow up, and I mean, they're family. I mean,
right.
And a familial tie in that context is very, very strong. So this isn't just this is more than just you'll see him as your brother and you'll be tight friends, but this is someone who's lived and worked with you, and you do want to gain this person as a son. And if you think about the idea that many children or many quivers are arrows in your quiver, right?
Right.
If there ever comes a time where you need help and you've been taking care of the people who work for you, they're going to be there to help you.
Right.
Because ultimately you're benefiting for one another.
I mean, that's the kind of leaders you want. I mean, that's the leadership that the military teaches, is that you want to be that servant leadership. You want to be a family where, it's like everyone in the military will say, the person in the foxhole, you're not fighting the enemy because you hate the enemy. You're fighting the enemy because you love your brother next to you.
Yep. Okay, for the sake of time, let's go ahead and go to the servant tab and pop through some of these. And I don't think, there is a lot of them. We'll go fast.
Do you have asterisks on this side too?
I do.
Okay.
Sort column E. You may have to do a filter. Yep. So Exodus 9:20. It's interesting. So the one among the one among the servants of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord made his servants and his livestock flee into the houses. So you really have a hierarchy here. You have Pharaoh, the servant of Pharaoh, and the servants of the servant, and that really brings to my mind a business. You have the CEO, you have the people who work, the vice president, and you got middle management under that. This is very. It is a king, but he is sovereign over his.
This is
land.
Exactly like the unmerciful servant, right?
Yeah, kind of.
You have the king who forgives the debt of his servant, and that servant goes around and does not forget the debt of his servant.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't a situation where they're walking around in chains being beat all the time.
Right.
These are probably rich people, especially the one who has servants below him. That it's kind of like, we keep using military examples too. You have a general, and then you have, in this situation, you'd have general, and then you'd have like centurions and stuff, people who are over big chunks of your army. That's what we're seeing. It's not the servanthood or servitude that, again, we would think of in a 21st century context. Numbers 31:49. Your servants, and they said to Moses, your servants have taken a census of men of war. This is people just submitting to Moses' authority. They refer to themselves as his servant because he's chosen by God and their prophet. And so we are your servant because ultimately we want to serve God too.
All right.
Deuteronomy 15:17. Verses 12 through 17 really are about provision required for servants set free on the seventh year.
Yeah, the sabbatical year or whatever year. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Not sabbatical year. Every 50th year was the
Jubilee.
Jubilee, yeah. Mm-hmm. And every 7th year was the Sabbath year. Yeah.
Right. You want to jump on some of those?
Yeah, I was trying to scroll through these just so we can zoom through some of them. Yeah, you mentioned just like they called themselves Moses' servants. They weren't his slaves. Again, this is the same exact word that is translated slave in other passages that we just went through, but now it's servant. Samuel, right? Samuel the prophet, pray for your servants, right? So they called themselves servants of Samuel, right? Just because they're willingly putting themselves under his authority, under his leadership. They're bondservants. That's the same way that the New Testament talks about servants, right? We become bondservants to the Lord. We willingly place ourselves under the kingship of God in order to serve him.
Speaking, Man, we've been using military language here, and 1 Samuel 17:8. This is the army of Israel is referred to as servants of Saul. You have, and that's consistent. Again, I'm not going to go through Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles is a whole bunch of whoever the king is, I'm your servant. Like if Billy's the king of another place and I want to go to him, even just to like talk trade or something, I would approach him in humility and say, hey, I, your servant, would like to talk to you about so-and-so. And if he were to come to my land, he would do the same thing back to me. It was really just an honorific. It was kind of a polite or respectful thing that was expected to be done. And any kind of hierarchy of authority, the person underneath would call themselves servant of the person above them.
Right.
Military, kingdom, whatever. So that's like a lot of what you're going to see in those history books. And we don't have to go through all those if you want to skip to Ezra, which is super interesting. So
even in today, so going back to what Matt just said, even because you can see that we still have modern context. In the executive branch, and even in many of the appointed positions within the federal government, you have people who will say the phrase that I serve at the pleasure of the president. They're servants of the president.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And this is all so far in the servant category. This is all abed. It's the same ones that are sometimes translated slave. And keep in mind, it was written in Hebrew, not in English. So if someone says, well, it says slave or it says servant, you have to say, well, that's a Hebrew word they translated. They may have misunderstood the context, or they could have been more specific. But here's what the Hebrew word actually means. And then you give them this whole range of, there's a bunch of stuff that this word is used to mean. It just doesn't mean guy in chains that you can beat up whenever you want. That's simply not the case.
Right. 1 Kings 12:7 is a good one. Then they spoke to him saying, if you will be a servant to this people today and will serve them and grant them their petition and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. And this is basically that a king should be a servant to the people so that they will serve him. Servant leadership.
1 Kings 20 verse 9 and 20 verse 32 are pretty interesting to me, because this is, in one hand, king of Israel calling himself a servant of Ben-Hadad. And then in verse 32, Ben-Hadad calling himself a servant of the king of Israel. So just like I said, if Billy is one kingdom and I'm another, and I go to him, I call myself his servant. And if he comes to me, he calls himself my servant. It's respect.
Slave. It's slave. Remember, Matt, it's slave.
It's always slave.
Right. Ezra has a bunch of different words, and it's translated servant, but it refers to everyone that's working in the temple. They're temple servants, people who are serving God and serving the people in the temple. Yeah.
Nethanim, Pelech, or Pelach, I guess. I don't know. Sharath. Like I said, we're consistently mispronouncing.
Right, and Nethanim, not Nephilim.
Oh, man. Nephilim. No, Nethinim. These are all, like you said, either serving in the temple or building the temple or something involved with construction. And I think also, which book is it where they build the wall later on? I may have left those out, but those words all translate as servant, but they can mean a variety of different things. And it really was based on what role they were serving in what place. But the translators decided to just call them servant, all of them.
Right.
Which feels kind of lazy to me, but whatever.
I think some of these last groups are really good. So Job 41:4, will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him for a servant forever? Again, Abed, just all the verses that we talked about with slavery, right? Will be a slave forever. This is servant through covenant. So we're making a covenant together, a contractual agreement, and now I'm going to serve you, right? This is the same thing. This is the new covenant. We become servants, bondservants to God. We place ourselves, we have allegiance to him. He's graced us, and we honor him and give him glory through service. Our end of the covenant is faithful servitude, right? To love him, to honor him, and give him glory. Another good one is Isaiah 42:1. Again, same exact word. Behold, my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. So, Matt, who is this servant? Who is this slave?
Well, y'all can't see it, but they're capitalized, so it has to be Jesus. Yeah, no, it's a prophecy about Christ.
Right.
in what he intends to do. Yeah.
So that if you know, if you want to be snarky with anyone who starts talking about, oh, God condoned slavery, it's like, yeah, he even came down to be our slave.
Yeah, and he was slave to himself. I mean, if we're talking
Right.
Trinity here, the Son is being called subservient to the Father, which gets into that. I think we had a Facebook post recently. Was it in our group or someone else's where I was talking about, I think it was maybe in Trinity. I was talking about the is the servitude of the Father or the Son to the Father eternal? Yeah, which I thought was an interesting question. I had never really, thought about it too much. But here, clearly, Christ is being called the servant of God, and we know from the New Testament, he refers to himself as God's servant. He's not going to say anything the Father doesn't want him to say. He's there to do the will of the Father, and that is servant language.
Right.
Talking about God, any person who submits to God is considered a servant. That's consistent throughout the Old Testament as well as the New. Any prophet that God is using is referred to as God's servant. So whether they like it or not, like even Balaam, who was we would call kind of a wicked prophet, he did what he was supposed to do because he didn't want to die, but he was still he was God's servant, like it or not. I don't know. There's still, I guess there's not too many left. So people who join themselves to God, minister to him, love his name, they're all his servants. The remnant, Isaiah 65:8, thus says the Lord, as the new wine is found in a cluster, and one says, do not destroy it, for there is benefit in it. So I will cut on behalf of my servants. So I will act on behalf of my servants in order not to destroy all of them. His servants here are his elect. Even though we could all say all of humanity is a servant to God in a sense, specifically his elect, the ones who are submitting to him, those are the servants he's talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in psychology or sociology, if you think about any organization, and you have certain rules that you're going to implement in your organization. And when you implement them, everybody in your organization cries, right? They all hate it. They think it's the stupidest rule ever, right? And then in about 15, 20 years, when you've had a big turnover and very few people left that remember how it was prior to, and a bunch of new people that, right? And then, right? Yeah. Everybody, there's no complaining. Everyone's like, oh, that's just how it is, of course, right? Duh. And I'm wondering if why don't we do this with the Bible? Because you can clearly see anyone, and there's plenty of scholarly books out there that are doing exactly what we're doing with the Bible and the word slavery, right? If they just go in there and say, let's make this all servitude, servants, all that stuff, right? People are going to go up in arms. All the atheists are going to be like, oh, see, look what they're doing. They're changing the Bible. Well, no, there's scholarly work, and yeah, they'll be complaining for a few years, but then nobody will complain about it anymore. Because they're like, oh, they're servants.
Once you pull the Band-Aid off, it stops hurting after a while.
Right.
Yeah. Jeremiah 25:9. I thought this was really interesting. Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land. So he's sending to Nebuchadnezzar, as in he's calling Nebuchadnezzar his servant. Nebuchadnezzar certainly was not worshiping God. Nebuchadnezzar was a pagan. He was wanting people to worship himself. And yet, God calls him a servant. Why? Because God is going to use him. And this goes back to what we've talked about in the past. God uses everybody. People get hung up on, but everybody has free will. Well, he gave us dominion over whether or not we submit to him. But beyond that, he's going to use us in our circumstances. And you're either a vessel of mercy or a vessel of wrath, a vessel for honorable use or dishonorable use. In this case, Nebuchadnezzar taking out Israel because Israel was rebelling against God. Mm-hmm. It was just he was a local king in the area that God was going to use. He built him up. He took him out. Same with Cyrus eventually. Cyrus the Great, is the one who, after several kingdoms go by after Babylon, eventually comes up and brings Israel back to the land. So in any case where God is using a kingdom, that king is God's servant, whether they're faithful or not.
Mm-hmm. That goes to the bigger picture, and we mentioned already, is that as God's children, right? Oh, I'm a heretic. I called all of us God's children. The whole human race are God's children, and we're here to be image bearers. We're all here to actually serve God, right? To serve Him, to do what He says, to honor Him, give Him glory. That's kind of what the purpose over here. And we see in the New Testament, we see multiple parables of the master leaves and he's to come back and judge his servants, right? His slaves, right? And that's not speaking of just people who are actually bondservants, but that's speaking of everyone. The Lord is going to judge the entire earth, and the earth are supposed to be serving Him and honoring Him and giving Him glory. So that there's that crossover of with these passages that we looked at, that we are all supposed to be God's servants. We're all supposed to willingly bow the knee, so to speak.
Yeah, and this ties into, again, shout out for the eventual episode we have with Dr. De Silva. This ties into patron-client reciprocity and how grace is supposed to work. And if God gave all of us grace, the expectation is not only that we honor Him and give Him thanks, Romans 1:21, whatever it is. It is not only that, but also we're in His debt. And while there's nothing we can do to pay off what He did, that shouldn't stop us from trying.
Right.
We should still work towards that end, and that's bearing fruit. That's producing righteousness that He closed the bride in at the end. So the idea of servanthood in the Bible is kind of universal. Everybody's a servant to somebody. You're always submitting to something, and that's how these words are used. Abed is used that way. You can pick on Exodus 21 all you want, but at the end of the day, that word has a very wide range of meanings, and you have to get into the mindset or the headspace of the Jew at the time to understand what those are actually saying. Again, I think Braxton and Jonathan did a good job with that. But
right, parable of the talents is that the master leaves and he's entrusted his property to his servants. Yeah. I mean, that's Genesis, right? That mankind has been put over to be in charge of the earth, right? It's his property. We're here as servants. And he's going to come back and see how we did.
Exactly. Okay. Thankfully, I remember the topic we were going to talk about for the mini. We're going to talk about the unforgivable sin and that kind of thing. Woo! Normally, when we talk about what we're going to talk about, we forget by the end of the episode. Because Billy's old, not me. Anything else before? I think so. We're going to do. Hopefully, we get Jonathan on next week, and we're going to talk about the Romans 9 thing. And then you never said whether you like this idea or not. You may hate it. I want to do an episode on numbers in the Bible and talk about, 3, 7,
not the book
12,
of Numbers,
40. Not the book of Numbers. That would be
no. Yeah, and I know we have
boring.
talked about some of this in. I think we did it in an episode when we talked about.
I don't remember
some of the prophecy stuff. I know we have written on it, and I know we've talked about it, but I don't remember where. It was one of the early episodes, so it was like forever ago.
Dedicated. Yeah, it was, and I think it'd be a fun dedicated episode. Just to go through, 6 is the number for work and man. And not that we're making up these categories, but pull out the verses and show. This seems to be how he's using it. And
just to summarize this whole slavery servant thing, it's very easy to look at the Old Testament and see that very broad terms. Basically, you put yourself, oftentimes, majority of the time, under the servitude of another. Oftentimes, there's an exchange of goods, so to speak. And that is the exact same way that the New Testament speaks of it. It's bondservants, right? The same words that are translated in, for instance, the King James as slave, right, are now translated in most modern things as bondservant or the servant, doulos. And as Paul says, you are a slave to the one whom you obey. I.e., when you go to work and you obey the people, your boss, or in your marriage relationship, whether the wife's in charge, if that's how your life is, or the husband's in charge, or the mom that's living in the basement's in charge, you are a slave to the one whom you obey. You are servants, you are slaves to the one whom you obey. And that, basically, our whole life is filled with socio-cultural contracts with one another where we are serving each other. We are slaves to various people groups. Whether that be government, jobs, families, schools. Yeah.
Isn't it interesting that Jesus says, this is how you're a leader. Serve the people around you. This is how you're great in the kingdom of heaven. Be a servant. It's like that's actually the goal, is to be a servant.
Right.
Which is on the head of, All right. So, got a couple episodes planned out for the next couple weeks. God willing, we get to do either one of them. But yeah, see you back on the mini cast for the unpardonable sin and that discussion that we've been having recently.
All right. Till next
it.
time.
God bless.
God bless.